Members of the Commonwealth Club and friends, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our new quarterly chairman, Mrs. Bernice Behrens.
Thank you, Jim, and good afternoon. It is my pleasure and honor to present Senator George S. McGovern, the senior senator from the state of South Dakota. Senator McGovern.
Will you show me how to raise this? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Behrens, my colleague in the Congress and friend, Congressman Phil Burton, members of the Commonwealth Club. Let me say, first of all, that any person in public life always regards it as a privilege to address this club. I am also grateful to be back in San Francisco. This is one of those rare cities that we carried in 1972, and along with along with Washington, D.C. and Massachusetts and other centers of enlightenment, I'm grateful to be back in this city. My topic has been identified as Détente in China and now Cuba. That topic perhaps has some logic chronologically, in that when I spoke here some 10 years ago, it was on the theme that we ought to be opening up new doors and windows to China, and ought to be re-examining our policy. I want to concentrate my remarks today on the subject of Cuba until we get to the question and answer period, when I'll be glad to comment on questions on any subject that is of interest to members of the club. If you fly the few miles which separate Cuba and America, you will cross over a separation of ideology which has been considered impassable for the last 15 years. The Cuban Revolution has been a matter of great concern in this country. It has confounded our foreign policy, which was unable to destroy it, but which I suspect still does not accept it. The Cuban militia in 1961 turned back and defeated the Bay of Pigs invasion. And then in the following year, the world was faced with a possible third world conflict over the Cuban Missile Crisis. So as one descends into Havana for the first time, I think it's understandable if you have the feeling that you're entering an alien and strange and remote area, and one where you expect to be treated with uncertainty and possibly with hostility. So on the flight back from Cuba, as you look down upon the Straits of Florida, you wonder why that brief span of water remains such a gulf of hostility between these two countries. You have left America with questions about Cuba, and now as the plane returns homeward, your questions also begin to turn towards the policy here at home. Why does our national leadership cling to the past in situations of this kind, while the conditions around us are rapidly changing? Why do we so often ignore the sound wisdom of Abraham Lincoln, that as our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. The first reality that has to be confronted in Cuba is that we face there a government which is fiercely proud of the revolution and which will do whatever they find necessary to preserve it. Just as at the Bay of Pigs, we suffered a stunning failure for a bright and attractive new administration here in our own country, so was that a head-filling experience and a triumph for a new government in Havana, a government headed by a 30-year-old leader. The economic embargo, which shortly followed, has been an ineffective sanction. It has not toppled the Castro regime. It has had the effect of forcing them into a closer reliance on the Soviet Union. The embargo obviously does impose some burdens and some hardships, but Cuba, no less than our own country, will not sell its principles. When the United States defends Israel, as I think it should, even in the face of an oil blockade, we should not expect others to surrender their principles under blockades or economic pressure. Nor will there be any likelihood of Cuba adopting our concepts of personal liberty or our system of government. There are political prisoners in Cuba. There is a controlled press. There is a party line. Posters and propaganda are everywhere, and it is not likely that American policy will change those manifestations. But we do not demand of other adversaries that they adopt our principles in order to make peace with us. A SALT treaty, for example, is not an endorsement of the Soviet economic and political system. Recognition of Castro would not be a recommendation of the Cuban regime. But the Cuban system is very likely to be permanent, not merely because it is authoritarian, but because from all available evidence, it appears to be popular. For the ordinary citizen, the standard of life has improved substantially since 1960. I think it's fair to say that for the first time in the memory of most Cubans, there are free schools of good quality for their children and adequate health care for their families when they're sick. The products of their labor and of the land, once the monopoly of a privileged few, have been made available on a broad scale to increasing numbers of people. Havana, which was once a center of crime, of gambling and prostitution and mafia control, is now a city largely free of those manifestations. And beyond all of this, there is the charismatic appeal of Fidel Castro. During a spontaneous stop at a little rural town that we were passing through on a 3.5-hour Jeep tour, I suggested to him that in the United States, when we come to a place like that where the people are out in the marketplace, we sometimes stop without any advance notice and get out and shake hands. So he agreed to that, and he was immediately engulfed by joyful Cubans, many of them who embraced him. It was something that would bring envy to the heart of any American politician, even one as popular as Phil Burton. But we might prefer that he submit both his personality and his performance to an open election. But in all reality, we cannot impose our political values on that society. Now, another fundamental reality is the Cuban desire for improved relations with the United States and with other countries in the hemisphere. The Castro government has made a number of important gestures, have sent a number of signals to indicate their desire for more normal and peaceful relations with the United States. The anti-hijacking agreement, which they have faithfully kept, the release of several American prisoners following the visit of Senator Javits and Senator Pell a year ago, the invitation to exchange baseball teams, which ought to be at least as effective as ping pong, the recent decision to return $2 million to the Southern Airways company that had been held for some time, which was a direct result of my visit to Havana and the letter that I took there from Senator Sparkman. And now it seems to me that in the Cuban view, the next step is up to us, and it comes in the form of either lifting or at least relieving part of the embargo that has faced Cuba for the last 15 years. The administration's position, as I understand it, is that we are bound to observe the embargo as a member of the Organization of American States that put on the sanctions in 1964. I might just add parenthetically that we had done it 4 years earlier. But a number of hemispheric nations, including those in the Organization of American States, some 10 of them are already trading with Cuba on an active scale. And while I was in Havana, Prime Minister Castro said for the first time that pending O.A.S. actions on the lifting of the sanctions, that he would consider it as a significant step on our part that would open the way for negotiations on other outstanding issues if we would lift the embargo even on medicine and on food, which are not covered by the O.A.S. sanctions. I think it's obvious that the Cubans have taken several first steps, and now that we should seriously consider this specific step of lifting the embargo without further delay. We should support a total repeal of the O.A.S. embargo, and then we should end all of our own economic sanctions against Cuba. Now, these are not, in my opinion, matters for negotiation. They're not matters that are going to produce any specific reciprocal move by Cuba, for the simple reason that they exercise no embargo against us. When I asked Mr. Castro what he would do in return for the lifting of the embargo, he went on to say that this would open the way for the discussion of other issues, but he said, you know, we have no embargo against the United States, and if your government insists on a trade-off, we could put on an embargo and then take it off when you take yours off. Cuban officials assured me that once trade is restored, there is no other issue that is of concern to us that they will not be willing to lay on the table for discussion, including the compensation of Americans whose property was nationalized after the revolution. Incidentally, I learned in Cuba that one of the first things nationalized was the Castro family ranch, which cost Mr. Castro the support of 2 or 3 members of his own family who've never forgiven him to this day. Cuban exiles might be permitted to visit their families and their homeland, and some Cubans would be permitted to travel to the United States. There will be no instant reconciliation on all of these issues, but there has been an accumulation of complicated issues over the years that will never be resolved until we begin this process that I'm urging here today. I believe this is possible because it's in the common sense interest of both Cuba and the United States. It really makes no sense for two neighboring countries not to be trading with each other. They want to sell us sugar, they want to sell us nickel, the cigars and rum, some of you may feel are not vital to life, nevertheless are very high quality. They would like to purchase agricultural produce, livestock products, electronic equipment, automobiles, equipment of all kinds from us. And while this is not a matter of major importance to the economy of the United States, both of our countries are going to survive, whether we lift the embargo or whether we don't. It does seem to me to be a common sense action on our part. And no ally is going to be undermined by it. No one's going to think we're weak. No American army is going to be defeated. No honor will be lost. Rather, common sense will be restored. Now, according to some observers that I have discussed this matter with in recent days, the president, or at least some of his advisors, do not want détente with Cuba until after the 1976 election because of the fear of a right-wing political reaction here in our own country. The same thing, I suspect, which kept us involved in Vietnam so many years after the realities in Asia dictated that we should leave. But as the president has said at other times, we must separate partisan politics when it comes to foreign policy judgments involving the national interest. I think it is important to debate foreign policy questions, but to do it within the context of what is in the interest of our country, what makes sense for the United States, not to do it with the fear of a reaction from some minority faction in our own country. There is no excuse to postpone these efforts to bring about better relations with Cuba. A number of officials still offer the rationalization that the Castro regime is an exporter of revolution, and I've heard that in several quarters since I returned from this trip. But when one considers what has happened in Chile on the part of our own interference, what happened in Vietnam, the CIA abuses that are now coming to light, our righteousness about exported interference in the affairs of others sounds a little bit hollow and hypocritical. And I would think it would sound that way especially to a country like Cuba that was invaded 15 years ago and has been the target of some of these CIA assassination efforts that we've been reading about. In any event, Cuban support for guerrilla movements diminished dramatically in the late 1960s, and in more recent months has been officially and explicitly curbed by pronouncements from the Cuban government. The final reality that I would like to just mention here in conclusion encompasses far more than our Cuban policy. It is the inevitable national diversity, the international diversity of the world in which we live, and the importance of our willing to face the fact that we do live in a very diverse world. In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt wrote a friend, and I quote, "Just at this moment, I am so angry with that infernal little Republic of Cuba that I would like to wipe it off the face of the earth. They have started an utterly unjustifiable and pointless revolution, and we have no alternative but to intervene." So this problem's been with us for a long time, but America does have an alternative, and it is to remember that we too were once an infernal little republic, that we too were blamed for an utterly unjustifiable and pointless revolution, and we too insisted in our Declaration of Independence that though we were very small and our firepower was weak, that we had the right to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle each nation. By the reckoning of John Adams, it is today, not July 4th, that marks the beginning of the bicentennial year, for it was on July 2nd, 1776, that independence was voted by the Continental Congress, and the members signed the Declaration itself some 2 days later. Adams exulted at the time that July 2nd, today's date, would be the most memorable day in the history of America. Now, the date was wrong because the printers of Philadelphia were slow, but his meaning is what is important. Independence Day, on whatever date we remember it, is the most treasured day in our national experience. And I think as we prepare for this coming bicentennial year, the great question is whether we will give renewed life to the beliefs with which we began some 200 years ago. My hope is that we will become exporters of what is best in our own revolution, not a revolution based on murder and assassinations and covert operations, but a revolution which, like the Declaration of Independence itself, glows with a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, or in President Kennedy's memorable phrase, a revolution that will seek to make the world safe for diversity. The principles of that revolution include a respect for the self-determination and the rule of law, a willingness to help others if they wish it and if their cause is worthy. Our founding ideal was that all persons are created equal, and we betray that beginning when our foreign policy makes other human beings and even our own sons the pawns of power politics. So what we need, it seems to me, is not something radically new, but a restoration of things lost, of the legacy of Jefferson and Adams, which made us authentically the last best hope of earth. In Cuba, Mr. Castro said to the American press, speaking in English at a press conference, "We belong to two different worlds, but we are neighbors. One way or another, we must find a way to live in peace." 2 centuries ago, the American revolutionaries spoke in even blunter language. "Don't tread on me," was their phrase. And now we must make the demand of our revolution the purpose of our foreign policy, that the nation shall not tread upon one another, but will treat with each other in an atmosphere of peace, that the world will learn at last the meaning of our common humanity, that all men are brothers, that all nations are neighbors, that differences are not a reason for conflict. For all of us, there is hope only in a world that is made safe for diversity, for a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McGovern, for that most informative speech on a subject in which we are clearly intensely interested. And now I'm happy to turn the meeting over to James Halley, the chairman of the executive committee of the club, for the traditional and very important question and answer period. Jim?
Senator, would you return to the podium? Would détente help solve the difficulties between the United States government and American Indians in South Dakota?
Well, we have, as all of you know, an extremely difficult problem in South Dakota at the present time. At the base of it, in my judgment, is the fact that the unemployment rate among the Indians is between 40 and 50%. We have some 40,000 Indians living on 7 reservations, most of them in an agricultural economy where the white ranchers and farmers surrounding the reservation need the land that they have in order to make a living, but where the reservations have to expand to provide the economic base for employment. We have tried some limited industrial development in that area, but it's very difficult. The work habits of the Indians has not proved suitable to industrial development, so that you have a condition for despair. None of this is to justify what has happened, the violence on either side. Certainly no civilized person can condone the brutal murder of the 2 young agents who were riddled with bullets trying to make an arrest in a kidnapping case a few days ago. But until we can find some way to solve this basic economic problem that confronts our Indian people in South Dakota with better jobs and improved housing and education and health care, I think violence is going to be the order of the day.
Will you support Governor Wallace if he is the Democratic Party nominee and candidate for president or vice president in 1976?
No.
What are, first, the chances, and B, the preconditions for peace in the Middle East?
Well, there, it seems to me, 3 conditions that have to be met if a settlement is to be achieved in the Middle East. Number 1, all states in the area are going to have to recognize the independence and the permanence of the State of Israel and be willing to enter into direct negotiations and normalized relations with the State of Israel. In return for that, Israel will have to return to the 1967 borders with perhaps some practical modifications, but basically to the 67 outline. And the third condition will have to be a recognition of Palestinian self-determination, the right either to an independent state on the West Bank and the Gaza area, or perhaps a confederation with Jordan or some other arrangement that is acceptable to the Palestinians. But I think those are the preconditions of a settlement. As far as I'm concerned, as a member of the United States Senate, I would vote that the United States join with other countries in guaranteeing a settlement that would follow roughly those lines.
Whatever happened to George Meany's veto-proof Congress?
Well, I'm not the best authority on George Meany, as some of you may know, but we have never had a veto-proof Congress in the years I've been there. Phil Burton is a very important leader in the House of Representatives, and he knows that even if we had 100% of all the Democrats in the House voting, we would not have a 2/3 majority. We have to depend on some votes on the Republican side of the aisle. We also have to recognize that we lose some Democrats on any substantive issue. So I think it's very difficult to expect the Congress of the United States to override vetoes on important controversial issues. We could do it on ones that aren't controversial, but those probably won't be vetoed. But when you get into a matter like public service employment or strip mining or housing or agriculture, there is controversy. And if a president is determined to rule this country with his own power plus 1/3 of the elected representatives of the people, he can do it. And there isn't very much the Congress can do about that. I think the veto has been used excessively. I think in some cases it's been used against the national interest. And I would hope that while the President has the constitutional right to do that, that he would also recognize in this country that it's important to give some heed to the majority wishes of the people's representatives in the Congress.
What was your impression of Arafat, and what is your opinion as to his ambitions?
Well, I think it's very hard to get any worthwhile impression of a man in an hour's time. I wouldn't want to try to put any assessment on his character or on his philosophy based on that visit. I wouldn't even judge my own colleagues in the Senate on some of those questions that I know much better. I would say this, that I found him to be a man who will converse in an intelligent and rational and restrained manner without reference to his public rhetoric. The hour-long visit I had with him was a civil discourse. He told me that he would accept as a basis for a settlement the three-point program that I outlined here a moment ago. When I asked him how that squared with what he had said in New York about the state of Israel becoming a unified democratic secular state, he said that is a dream that might be accomplished in a period of 50 or 100 years, but it is not something to be accomplished by force or violence, and that the three-point program that I mentioned here earlier, he would find an acceptable basis for a settlement. Whether or not that, in fact, is the case, I have no way of knowing any more than any of you. But at least that's what he said, and when I reported it publicly in a large press conference in Jerusalem, I was told that he would repudiate it. But he has not repudiated it, even though it was widely reported, and I think we ought to explore that further with him and with the organized states in the area.
What influence will the gains of communist parties in Europe have upon United States foreign policy?
Well, it needn't be fatal to American policy. I think that at a time when we're moving towards better relations with countries that are frankly communist all the way, China, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and others, that the growth of some political communist power in Italy, in Portugal, and other parts of Western Europe, while it's something that we regret, I don't think it's catastrophic. I don't think it's something that's fatal to America's interests. I would hope that more and more we would try to press towards détente with the major communist powers, and that we would understand that there isn't an awful lot we can do about the internal political developments, even of old allies in Western Europe, any more than they can dictate political events in this country.
In the interests of the public at large, should the power of labor unions be curbed somewhat?
Well, I think as long as we have enormous concentrations of capital on one side, it's important that we have strong organized labor on the other. I sometimes have the feeling that the American consumer is squeezed from both sides, that perhaps what is needed is stronger protection for the consumer, perhaps more vigorous enforcement of the antitrust statutes. But given the present power of large business organizations in this country, I think it's inevitable and essential that we have strong and vigorous and active labor unions as a counterbalance.
If the majority of the people in South Korea and Thailand favored communism to another war, should we pull out entirely?
Well, I'm not sure that question is posed in relevant terms. First place, I don't know how we have any way of knowing what the preferences are of the people in South Korea politically or in Thailand. But I would say this, that if the presumption of the question is right, that the overwhelming majority of the people in those two areas want to live under a communist form of government, I don't think that is their preference, but assuming that the preference is right, obviously we shouldn't go in there with military power to try to force them to live under a system that they don't want. I do worry about the situation in Korea. I worry about the presence of some 40,000 American troops stationed there all these years who seem to me to be virtual hostages to the political situation in South Korea. If violence does come, I fear that we may make a judgment as to whether we ought to be involved or whether we shouldn't on the basis of protecting the troops we already have there. The troops ought to follow a clear decision on our part, approved by the Congress of the United States, that military intervention is necessary. We ought not to be pulled in to a complicated and confused military and political struggle simply because we happen to have troops already involved there. That's why I wish we would use whatever time we have before anything like that occurs to explore with other major countries in the area, particularly with the Chinese and the Russians, the possibility of some kind of mutual security arrangements to guarantee the independence of both North and South Korea.
We have time, but for one more question. Before asking it, let me thank you, Senator George McGovern, for your address on the topic Détente, China and now Cuba, the third century of the American Revolution. On behalf of the members of the Commonwealth Club of California, many of whom are gathered here in the Ralston Room of the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, as well as those who hear your remarks rebroadcast over the club's radio network of 103 stations providing public service programming in addition to the National Public Radio Network and the Voice of America. After your response to this last question, the meeting will stand adjourned. Senator, when will you announce your candidacy?
Well, I knew that question was coming, but the chances are at the very least 100 to 1 that there won't be any announcement of the McGovern candidacy for 1976. I say in all candor to you that I have had no plans at all since the 72 election to be a candidate again. I have sought the advice of some of my friends and supporters as to what role I could play that might be most useful in 1976, whether in the Senate, whether as a former presidential candidate endorsing one of the contestants now in the field, or vetoing some of the others, or simply speaking out on the floor of the Senate, or as a very small number have suggested, even trying it again myself. But my own conviction at the present time is that I should not be a candidate again, but should do the best job I can of being an effective member of the Senate. Thank you very much for the